My name is Samantha. I am 33 years old, and my parents skipped my doctoral graduation because they thought it was pointless. They chose to attend my younger brother Tyler's app launch party instead. A week later, a $12 billion hedge fund hired me as a director with a $7 million signing bonus, and my very first assignment was to liquidate my brother's bankrupt company. When my mother called begging for a family meeting to save him, I showed up with a surprise they will never forget. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The air inside the university auditorium was thick with anticipation, the kind of electric energy that only comes from thousands of people celebrating a milestone they spent years working toward. The grand hall was filled to absolute capacity. Everywhere I looked, I saw seas of proud parents holding massive bouquets of flowers, holding up their smartphones to capture every single second and wiping away tears of joy. The deafening sound of cheering echoed off the high vaulted ceilings every time the dean called a new name across the massive stage. Air horns blasted from the upper balconies. It was a symphony of validation, a loud and chaotic testament to the power of family support. I sat perfectly still in the middle of row G, wearing the heavy velvet gown and the deep blue hood that signified my doctorate in quantitative finance. I was officially an algorithmic data architect. I had spent the last 4 years of my life grinding through complex mathematical models, eating cheap noodles in a freezing apartment, and pulling double shifts just to keep the lights on. I had done it completely alone. And as I sat there in the middle of all that overwhelming celebration, my eyes were locked onto 3 completely empty chairs right at the edge of my row. Seats 12, 13, and 14. Those seats were supposed to belong to my father Richard, my mother Patricia, and my younger brother Tyler. I had sent them the formal invitation 6 months in advance. I had followed up with phone calls. I had even offered to pay for their parking near the campus. My mother had promised they would be there. She had looked me in the eye at Thanksgiving and said they would not miss the day I finally finished my schooling. But as the ceremony dragged on into its second hour, the velvet fabric of those 3 chairs remained completely undisturbed. A father in the row directly in front of me leaned over the barrier and pulled his daughter into a massive hug, kissing her forehead while her mother snapped a dozen photos. The daughter was crying, thanking them for believing in her. I watched them with a strange sense of detachment. I did not cry. The tears had dried up a very long time ago. I realized in that moment that I was not even surprised by the empty seats. Disappointed, perhaps, but not surprised. For as long as I could remember, I had been the invisible child in our household. Everything I achieved was met with a dismissive nod, while every single thing my brother Tyler did was celebrated like a historic achievement. I was expected to simply exist quietly while Tyler was given the world on a silver platter. The empty chairs were not a mistake. They were a statement. They were a physical manifestation of exactly where I stood in their list of priorities. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the chaotic noise of the auditorium wash over me. I adjusted the heavy sleeves of my graduation gown, staring straight ahead at the stage, waiting for the inevitable excuse. I did not have to wait long. A sharp vibration buzzed against my thigh. I reached into the pocket of my dress beneath the heavy graduation gown and pulled out my phone. The bright screen illuminated the shadows of the auditorium. It was a text message from my mother Patricia. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the words. "We cannot make it. Tyler app launch party is today and he needs our support. Getting another pointless degree at 33 is not an achievement, Samantha. Grow up and get a real job." I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. I read the message a second time and then a third time, letting the sheer audacity of her words sink into my brain. The sheer cruelty of it was breathtaking. My brother Tyler was 30 years old. He liked to call himself a tech entrepreneur, but in reality, he was a professional dependent. His new app was a buggy, useless piece of software that he had spent the last 2 years developing using entirely our parents' money. The launch party Patricia was talking about was not a real business event. It was a vanity project. It was an excuse for Tyler and his wife Jasmine to rent out an expensive downtown lounge, hire a premium open bar, and pretend they were part of the tech elite. Jasmine was obsessed with appearances. She ran a lifestyle blog that nobody read, constantly flaunting designer clothes and expensive dinners, all funded by my parents, draining their savings to keep Tyler looking successful. My mother had looked at my 4 years of grueling self-funded doctoral research in algorithmic data architecture and called it a pointless degree. She had looked at my financial independence and told me to get a real job, all while she was standing in a rented nightclub, paying for my brother's fake success. Something fundamental shifted inside my chest in that exact second. A heavy, suffocating chain that I had been dragging around for my entire life suddenly snapped. The desperate, pathetic need for their approval, the hope that one day they would look at me with the same pride they reserved for Tyler, it all completely vanished. It evaporated into nothing. I did not type a long emotional paragraph back to her. I did not beg for an explanation or tell her how much she had hurt me. I did not give her the satisfaction of knowing she had ruined my day. I simply pressed the delete button. The message disappeared from my screen. I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket. I reached up and carefully removed the velvet doctoral cap from my head. I stood up from my chair right in the middle of the university president, delivering his commencement speech. The people sitting next to me looked up in confusion, whispering as I squeezed past them. I walked straight past the 3 empty seats at the end of the row. I did not look back at them. I marched up the carpeted aisle toward the heavy wooden exit doors at the back of the auditorium. An usher in a bright red vest stepped in front of me, holding up his hands. He whispered that they were about to start calling the names for the doctoral candidates, and that I needed to return to my seat. I stopped, looked the usher directly in the eyes, and handed him my velvet cap. Then I unzipped the graduation gown, let it fall from my shoulders, and handed that to him as well. I told him I did not need it anymore. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open and stepped out into the crisp, bright afternoon sunlight. The silence outside the auditorium was absolute perfection. I walked down the concrete steps of the campus, the cool breeze hitting my face. I pulled my phone back out of my pocket. I opened my contacts list. I scrolled down to Patricia. I pressed block caller. I scrolled to Richard. I pressed block caller. I scrolled to Tyler and Jasmine. I blocked them both. As I walked to my car, leaving the campus behind me forever, my mind was entirely clear. The mourning period for my family was officially over. From this moment forward, I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the invisible daughter begging for scraps of affection. I was an independent woman with a brilliant mind and a completely empty slate. And little did my parents know my real job was about to bring their entire house of cards crashing down. 2 days had passed since I walked out of my university auditorium and left my graduation gown in the hands of a stranger. I was currently sitting on the faded rug of my cramped one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by brown cardboard boxes and packing tape. My living space was a testament to 4 long years of absolute financial sacrifice. There were no expensive designer clothes hanging in my small closet, and no expensive furniture resting in my small living room. Every single spare dollar I had earned from working long hours as a teaching assistant had gone straight into paying for my research data sets and expensive server hosting fees. While my younger brother was busy driving leased luxury cars and popping imported champagne at expensive rooftop bars on our parents' dime. I was eating generic brand oatmeal and debugging complex code until 3 in the morning. My mother had called my modest lifestyle pathetic. She frequently told her wealthy country club friends that I was a perpetual student who was simply too afraid to enter the real working world. But as I carefully packed my heavily annotated textbooks into a sturdy shipping box, I felt absolutely no regret whatsoever. The silence in my apartment was incredibly peaceful. I had not received a single text message or voicemail from my family since blocking them. I was completely unbothered. I was finally free from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me. I reached for the heavy roll of packing tape when my cell phone suddenly buzzed loudly against the cold hardwood floor. I wiped the dust off my hands and picked it up, expecting it to be my landlord calling about the deposit. Instead, the screen displayed an incoming call from a Manhattan area code, 212. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. I rarely received phone calls from unknown numbers, but something told me to answer it. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I offered a standard professional greeting. The voice on the other end was deep calm and carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who was used to being in absolute control of any room he entered. He introduced himself as Jonathan Maxwell, the Chief Executive Officer of Vertex Global. I sat back on my heels, resting my hand on a cardboard box. Vertex Global was not just a company, it was an absolute titan in the financial sector. They were a $12 billion hedge fund known for their aggressive and highly sophisticated quantitative trading strategies. They were the kind of firm that hired the top 1% of graduates from elite institutions and fired them just as quickly if they did not perform. I asked him how I could help him, assuming he was calling to verify some academic data or ask for a consultation on a specific financial model. Jonathan Maxwell chuckled a low, rich sound that echoed through the phone speaker. He told me he was not calling for a consultation. He told me he was calling because his team of senior quantitative analysts had been quietly monitoring my doctoral research for the past 8 months. He explained that my final dissertation on predictive algorithms for distressed asset liquidation had caught the attention of his chief technology officer. They had run my theoretical models through their historical market data simulators. The results had completely shocked their entire department. My mother had called my degree pointless. She had told me to grow up and get a real job. Yet here was the chief executive officer of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country telling me that my mind was a rare asset. Jonathan spoke with intense precision. He broke down exactly why my work was so valuable to them. He said that my algorithm possessed a unique capability to identify hidden value in failing corporate structures while simultaneously isolating toxic debt before it could infect the broader portfolio. It was exactly the kind of aggressive high-level strategy Vertex Global was looking to implement for their new fiscal quarter. He told me that they did not want to license my algorithm. They wanted the architect behind it. They wanted me. He said my academic career was over, and it was time for me to take my rightful place at the top of the food chain. I felt a cold, sharp sense of vindication wash over me. I was not jumping up and down or screaming with joy. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The years of isolation and financial struggle were instantly validated. Then Jonathan Maxwell got down to the actual numbers. He did not waste time with multiple rounds of interviews or human resources screening calls. He was a man who saw exactly what he wanted and bought it on the spot. He offered me a position as the director of quantitative strategy for their newly formed distressed assets division. He told me I would have my own team of analysts and a corner office in their Manhattan headquarters. I stayed completely silent, waiting for the financial compensation package. Jonathan did not pause. He stated that my starting base salary would be $1,200,000 a year. He let that number hang in the air for just a moment before adding the final devastating blow. He said that to ensure I did not take my algorithm to any of their competitors, Vertex Global was prepared to offer an immediate signing bonus of $6,500,000, structured primarily in restricted stock units with a cash upfront portion. The total first-year compensation package was $7,700,000. I looked around the confines of my tiny apartment. I looked at the generic brand oatmeal resting on my kitchen counter and the worn-out sneakers sitting by the front door. $7,700,000. It was a sum of money so massive it felt almost abstract. It was more money than my parents and my golden child brother would see in their entire lifetimes combined. It was the ultimate weapon. It was complete, untouchable freedom. I did not ask for 24 hours to think about it. I did not ask to negotiate the terms. I knew exactly what my work was worth, and I knew Vertex Global was offering a premium to secure my loyalty. I told Jonathan Maxwell that I accepted his offer immediately. He sounded genuinely pleased. He told me human resources would overnight the contract to my apartment and that a private car would be waiting to bring me to New York at the end of the week. He welcomed me to the firm and hung up the phone. I slowly lowered my cell phone to the floor. I did not cry. I did not cheer. I simply grabbed the roll of clear packing tape and continued sealing my cardboard shipping boxes. The powerless scapegoat daughter they always looked down upon was dead. The director of quantitative strategy had just been born, and I already knew my very first day on the new job was going to be an absolute massacre. The heavy black Pelican case arrived at my apartment early Monday morning, delivered by a private courier who required 3 separate signatures and a biometric scan before handing it over. Inside the impact-resistant foam rested a matte black encrypted laptop. It was my direct portal to the Vertex Global mainframe. I placed it on my small kitchen table. I plugged it in and booted up the system. The screen glowed with a crisp white logo before demanding my newly generated security credentials. I typed in my password and pressed enter. The interface that loaded was a masterpiece of financial engineering. It was sleek, intuitive, and pulsing with real-time global market data. I spent an hour familiarizing myself with the proprietary software. I was officially the director of quantitative strategy. My mandate was clear. I was to take over the distressed assets portfolio. In the world of high finance, distressed assets were essentially the toxic waste of the corporate world. They were loans and debts from failing companies that banks no longer believed would ever be repaid. A firm like Vertex Global would swoop in and buy this debt for pennies on the dollar. If the company went bankrupt, Vertex had the legal right to strip the company down to its studs and sell off the office furniture, the software patents, and anything else of value to recoup their investment. Jonathan Maxwell hired me because my algorithms were excellent at deciding which companies needed to be put out of their misery. I took a sip of my black coffee and clicked on the folder labeled Tier 1 Liquidation Targets. These were the companies currently bleeding cash. My job was to analyze the financial data and execute the final judgment. The folder opened, revealing a list of 30 different corporate entities. I moved my cursor to the very first file on the list. The company was flagged with a bright red status indicator, meaning they had missed their last 3 interest payments. I clicked the file and watched as the digitized corporate dossier expanded across my screen. The header loaded, displaying the registered name, Apex Solutions. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Apex was a common word in the tech industry. I scrolled down to the executive summary section to check the registered founders and officers. There it was, typed in stark black letters. Chief Executive Officer Tyler Richard. It was my younger brother. It was his company. The very same company my parents had skipped my graduation to celebrate. The very same company that my mother had claimed was the reason I needed to get a real job. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing screen. The sheer statistical improbability of this moment was staggering. Out of thousands of failing startups in the country, Vertex Global had somehow purchased the debt of my brother's vanity project. As I looked at the acquisition data, the reality crystallized. Vertex Global algorithms were designed to automatically purchase debt bundles that fit a highly specific criteria of extreme financial mismanagement. Tyler had built a company so fundamentally flawed that it had triggered an automated buy order from a $12 billion hedge fund. The numbers were absolutely pathetic. 2 years ago, Tyler had secured a $5 million venture capital loan to build his software application. According to the documents on my screen, Vertex Global had just purchased that exact $5 million debt package from the original lender for 20 cents on the dollar. Vertex had paid $1 million to own $5 million of his corporate debt. Because I was the director of this portfolio, I was the one holding the leash. I was his primary creditor. I was essentially his boss. I clicked through the attached financial statements. The deeper I went into the files, the more disgusted I became. He was running a personal piggy bank. The $5 million loan was supposed to be used for software engineers, server architecture, and marketing campaigns. I saw recurring monthly charges for a luxury office lease in Boston. I saw expensed meals at steakhouses. I saw $60,000 categorized as corporate transportation, which I immediately knew was the lease payment for his wife Jasmine's luxury vehicle. The actual software development had been outsourced to a cheap overseas firm, and the resulting code was so full of errors it was practically useless. Tyler had burned through almost $4 million in less than 24 months with absolutely zero revenue to show for it. He was drowning in toxic debt, and his original lenders had panicked and sold the loan to Vertex to stop their own bleeding. The lavish launch party my parents attended was not a celebration of a successful product. It was a desperate attempt to attract new investors before the house collapsed. My mother had called my 4 years of rigorous academic research pointless, while my brother was actively committing corporate fraud right under her nose. I felt a cold, calculated calm wash over me. A few days ago, I had been the family scapegoat crying in an empty auditorium. Now I held the absolute power to dismantle my brother's entire life with a single keystroke. The legal documents clearly stated that because Apex Solutions had missed 3 consecutive debt payments, Vertex Global had the right to instantly trigger a default clause. Activating that clause would immediately terminate Tyler as the chief executive officer, seize all remaining corporate bank accounts, and begin the liquidation process of all company assets. He had allowed my parents to treat me like garbage while he soaked up all their praise and financial support. He had paraded around like a genius entrepreneur while secretly squandering millions of dollars on expensive dinners and fancy cars for his arrogant wife. Now the bill was finally due. I did not execute it yet. I knew that simply destroying his company quietly from behind a computer screen would not be enough. I needed my parents to see exactly who they had chosen over me. I needed them to understand the sheer magnitude of his failure and the absolute reality of my power. I needed to wait for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine. I saved the financial audit to my desktop. I leaned back in my chair and took another slow sip of my black coffee. The coffee tasted better than it ever had before. The universe had just handed me the ultimate weapon, wrapped in a neat little corporate package. They had absolutely no idea that the daughter they threw away was currently sitting in a small apartment holding the keys to their complete financial destruction. I closed the laptop as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my living room. I felt a profound sense of closure, knowing my past was officially dead. There was no more waiting for their approval or hoping they would finally see my value. I had built my foundation from scratch, and it was made of solid steel. My entirely new life was beginning, and it was going to be completely glorious. I was ready for whatever came next. A full week had passed since I accepted the position at Vertex Global, and my life had transformed at a dizzying pace. I had traded my cramped apartment and generic oatmeal for a sprawling corner office, overlooking the Manhattan skyline and a dedicated team of elite quantitative analysts. The work was intense, but I thrived in the high-pressure environment. I spent my days diving deep into complex financial algorithms, dismantling toxic corporate structures, and executing strategic liquidations with absolute precision. My team respected me, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly valued for my intellect. I had not spoken a single word to my family since the day I walked out of my university graduation. They remained permanently blocked on my personal phone, and I felt nothing but profound peace. However, I knew the silence would not last forever. In the world of high finance secrets, rarely stay hidden for long, especially when large sums of money are involved. On Thursday morning, a highly respected industry newsletter published a featured article about Vertex Global and its aggressive new restructuring strategy. The author had somehow gotten a hold of the internal hiring memos. The headline boldly announced that Vertex had poached a brilliant algorithmic data architect from the academic world to lead their distressed assets division. The article mentioned me by name. It praised my doctoral research and, most importantly, It leaked the exact details of my compensation package, including the $6,500,000 signing bonus. I read the article while sipping my morning coffee, knowing exactly what was about to happen. The blast radius of that newsletter would inevitably reach the affluent suburbs where my parents lived. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my personal cell phone buzzed on my desk. The caller identification displayed an unknown number. I normally ignored unknown numbers, but a strange intuition told me to answer this one. I picked up the phone and offered a polite professional greeting. A voice came through the speaker that made my blood run instantly cold. It was my mother, Patricia. Her tone was not apologetic. It was not angry. Instead, it was sickeningly sweet. It was the exact same artificial voice she used when speaking to the wealthy wives at her country club. She completely ignored the fact that I had blocked her number. She completely ignored the fact that she had abandoned me on my graduation day and told me my degree was pointless. She acted as if we had just spoken yesterday and everything was perfectly normal. She called me her sweet girl and asked how I was doing. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair letting her talk. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked her how she got this number and what she wanted. Patricia let out a forced high-pitched laugh. She told me she had to borrow a friend's phone because she was having trouble getting through to my line. Then she dropped the act and got straight to the point. She told me there was a family emergency and that we needed to have an urgent meeting tomorrow at noon. She demanded I meet them at the Oak Ridge Country Club, the highly exclusive private establishment where my parents spent most of their time pretending to be richer than they actually were. She told me to dress nicely for once because they had a very important matter to discuss. She did not ask if I was available. She simply expected me to drop everything and obey her command just like I always did when I was younger. I knew exactly what this urgent family meeting was really about. They had seen the financial newsletter, they knew about my massive signing bonus, and they were going to try to use my money to save my brother Tyler from his catastrophic business failures. They thought I was still the same desperate, eager to please daughter who would empty her bank account just to earn a single word of praise from them. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the executioner's axe over my brother's company. I smiled a cold, hard smile. I told my mother I would be there at noon sharp. She sounded incredibly smug when she hung up the phone. She actually thought she had won. She thought summoning me to her prestigious country club would intimidate me into submission. As soon as the call disconnected, I stood up from my desk and walked out to the main floor. I approached the secure corporate printers and logged into the Vertex mainframe. I opened the completely finalized liquidation file for Apex Solutions. I pressed print. The heavy-duty machine whirred to life, spitting out 50 pages of devastating legal and financial reality. It included the original venture debt contract, the default clauses, the forensic audit proving my brother's corporate fraud, and the termination papers stripping him of his title as chief executive officer. I gathered the warm pages and bound them in a thick black leather portfolio. This was my ammunition. But I knew that bringing the documents was only half the battle. I was walking into the Oak Ridge Country Club, a place where people judged your entire worth based on the label sewn into the collar of your jacket. My mother had specifically told me to dress nicely as a final petty insult to my previous financial struggles. I decided I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. I left my office early and took a private car straight to the high-end shopping district on Fifth Avenue. I walked into a luxury boutique where the sales associates offered me champagne on a silver tray. I did not browse. I told them exactly what I needed. I spent $4,000 on a tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. The fabric was immaculate, cutting a sharp, powerful silhouette that radiated absolute authority. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and sleek black designer heels. When I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, I did not recognize the woman staring back at me. The tired, stressed student was completely gone. In her place stood a formidable corporate executive who held the power to destroy lives with a single signature. I paid for the suit, handed my old clothes to the sales associate to throw away, and walked out of the store. As I rode back to my apartment with the leather portfolio resting on my lap, I felt a thrilling sense of anticipation. Tomorrow at noon, my family was going to try to ambush me. They were going to try to manipulate me and drain me dry, but they were walking straight into a trap of their own making. The stage was perfectly set, and I was ready to deliver a performance they would never forget. I watched the city lights blur past my window, knowing that by tomorrow afternoon, my toxic family would finally understand the true cost of their betrayal. The pathetic game was over, and I held every single winning card in my carefully manicured hands. I pulled my private car up to the grand entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club exactly 5 minutes before noon. The sprawling estate was a monument to old money and exclusive privileges, featuring perfectly manicured golf courses and towering white pillars. In the past, walking up these steps always made my stomach tie into knots. My parents used to bring me here for mandatory holiday dinners, and they spent the entire time criticizing my posture, my clothes, and my lack of a wealthy husband. But today, my stomach was perfectly calm. I stepped out of the car wearing my brand new charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, clutching the thick black leather portfolio containing my brother's ultimate financial execution. The valet attendants and front desk staff treated me with immediate deference. My suit commanded absolute respect. The hostess led me through the opulent dining room toward the sunlit outdoor terrace. I quickly spotted my family sitting at a prime corner table overlooking the 18th hole. My father, Richard, was scrolling through his phone looking annoyed. My mother, Patricia, was sipping sparkling water trying to make eye contact with the wealthy wives at adjacent tables. My brother, Tyler, slouched in his chair, wearing an expensive designer linen shirt. He looked tired and hungover, the perfect picture of a failing entrepreneur. Sitting right next to him was his wife, Jasmine. She was a 29-year-old striking black woman with an elitist personality. Jasmine was holding her phone high, recording a video for her lifestyle blog. She panned the camera across the brunch spread, and her Cartier bracelets showing her followers how luxurious her life was. Her online brand was built on the illusion of limitless wealth, funded by the failing company currently defaulting on my desk. I walked up to the table and stood quietly for a brief moment. Patricia was the first person to notice me. Her fake country club smile instantly froze on her face as she took in my sharp appearance. She was expecting to see the exhausted, struggling student she had abandoned at graduation. Instead, she was looking at a formidable corporate executive. Richard slowly glanced up from his phone and narrowed his eyes, unable to hide his deep confusion. Tyler simply stared blankly at my outfit. Jasmine lowered her phone and ended her recording. She looked me up and down with a deliberate sneer. She hated me because I refused to worship her curated aesthetic. She leaned back and offered a patronizing smile. She spoke loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear her insults. She asked if I was renting designer clothes for my little data entry job now. She told me not to spill water on the suit because I could not afford the dry cleaning bill. She chuckled coldly, and Tyler joined in with a dismissive laugh. I did not flinch. I did not snap back in anger. I simply pulled out the empty wooden chair sitting across from Tyler and sat down gracefully. The heavy leather portfolio rested securely on my lap. I looked directly into Jasmine's eyes with absolute and terrifying cold detachment. I did not correct her false assumptions about my job title. I did not tell her that my signing bonus alone could easily buy her entire life 10 times over. I simply let the pathetic insult hang in the warm air, allowing her to feel completely victorious. A smartly dressed waiter approached our table to take my drink order. I politely asked for a simple glass of sparkling water with a fresh slice of lemon. Patricia cleared her throat loudly and tried to take full control of the tense situation. She leaned forward over the table and put on her sickeningly sweet voice. She told me how incredibly glad she was that I could take time away from my little spreadsheets to join them. She declared that family was the absolute most important thing in the entire world, and that we needed to support each other during stressful financial times. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cold water and silently nodded, allowing her to continue digging her own grave. Richard aggressively jumped into the conversation, speaking with the harsh, authoritative tone he always used to intimidate me when I was a child. He firmly stated that Tyler was dealing with some very minor cash flow issues at his tech startup. He used complicated corporate buzzwords to make the massive multi-million-dollar failure sound like a temporary and completely normal business setback. He complained that the current market was being incredibly unfair to brilliant young innovators like my brother. Tyler puffed out his chest proudly and nodded in strong agreement, completely blind to the devastating reality of his own gross incompetence. I sat perfectly still, listening to them spin their truly pathetic web of transparent lies. They were putting on a desperate and theatrical performance, trying to maintain their fragile egos, while simultaneously preparing to beg me for a massive sum of money. Jasmine picked up her expensive phone again, pretending to text someone very important. But I could easily see the slight terrified tremor in her manicured hands. The grand illusion of their perfect wealthy life was actively cracking wide open, and they were secretly terrified. They had absolutely no idea that I already knew every single devastating detail of their complete financial ruin. They did not know that I had spent the entire morning reviewing the forensic audit of Tyler's massive fraudulent spending. They did not know that the luxury car Jasmine loved showing off online was merely days away from being legally repossessed by my company. I watched them perform their little play, feeling nothing but a clinical sense of curiosity. I was giving them enough rope to hang themselves, and they were eagerly tying the knot. I rested my hand gently on the leather portfolio, patiently waiting for the inevitable demand. The ambush was unfolding exactly as I had so perfectly predicted. The silence at the table stretched for a few long seconds after Jasmine delivered her petty insult. I simply looked at her directly and smiled a tight, polite smile that offered absolutely nothing. My father Richard recognized that the dynamic was not playing out the way he had envisioned. He was accustomed to me cowering the moment I was criticized. Seeing me sit there completely unbothered in my expensive suit seemed to agitate him deeply. He cleared his throat with a loud, authoritative rumble and leaned his heavy forearms against the crisp, white tablecloth. He adjusted his gold watch, a subtle power move he always used before delivering a lecture. He did not even say congratulations on your new job, Samantha. He did not mention my doctoral graduation that he had skipped just a week prior. He did not say he was proud of the fact that his daughter had just been hired as a director at a $12 billion hedge fund. Instead, my father Richard looked at me with an expression of deep parental disappointment and launched straight into a carefully rehearsed monologue about family duty. He lowered his voice, adopting the solemn tone of a patriarch navigating a tragedy. He started by telling me that the world was an incredibly cruel place. He said that the only thing that truly matters in this life is the blood that runs in our veins. I watched his jaw tense as he spoke. He told me that a family is like a single living organism, and when one part of the body is suffering, the rest must rush in to heal it. It was a poetic sentiment entirely fabricated to manipulate my emotions. I knew exactly where this was going, but I let him continue spinning his web of deceit. Richard then immediately shifted his focus directly to my brother Tyler, who was sitting across from me, looking like a tragic hero. My father confidently declared that Tyler was a visionary. He actually used the word visionary. He said that Tyler possessed a rare mind for technology and that his software application was going to revolutionize the industry. According to Richard, the only reason Tyler was currently experiencing what he vaguely referred to as a temporary cash flow interruption was because the venture capital market was being completely unfair. He blamed the economy. He blamed short-sighted investors who simply could not comprehend the magnitude of Tyler's genius. He painted my brother not as a spectacular failure who had fraudulently squandered millions, but as a noble victim of circumstance. The gaslighting was so incredibly thick, I could almost feel it suffocating the air around the table. Richard looked me dead in the eyes and told me that while I had chosen the safe, cowardly path of hiding behind textbooks in academia, Tyler had actually been out in the real world taking massive risks. He insinuated that my success was easy and purely theoretical, while Tyler's struggles were the honorable wounds of a true warrior. Patricia chimed in right on cue, nodding her head in vigorous agreement. She reached over and patted Tyler's arm, telling him that they all believed in him unconditionally. Then she turned her piercing gaze back to me, telling me that God had blessed me with this financial windfall not so I could act superior, but so I could fulfill my ultimate purpose as a supportive sister. They were actively trying to rewrite reality and make me feel entirely responsible for my brother's well-being. Richard leaned in closer, his voice dripping with manipulative sincerity. He told me that I owed it to the family to step up. He reminded me that he and Patricia had paid for my undergraduate degree 10 years ago, completely ignoring the fact that I had funded my entire doctorate myself. He said that they had provided the foundation for my life, and now it was my turn to repay that massive debt. He explicitly stated that if Tyler lost his company, it would not just be a business failure, but a catastrophic moral failure on my part, because I had the power to prevent it and chose to be selfish instead. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute toxicity radiating from my own parents. They were actively weaponizing my empathy. They wanted me to feel guilty for succeeding, and to believe that my newly acquired wealth was a communal family asset designed exclusively to bail out the golden child. My brother Tyler sat there looking completely entitled to my money. He did not say a single word in his own defense. He just let our parents do the heavy lifting, letting them bully and guilt-trip me into submission, just like they had done for the past 30 years. He genuinely believed his failures were somehow more valuable than my triumphs. I did not break eye contact with my father or argue with his ridiculous claims. I did not point out the blatant hypocrisy of them begging for my money right after telling me to get a real job. I just let the silence stretch out, letting their desperate manipulation hang in the heavy air. I kept my hands resting gently on the black leather portfolio sitting in my lap. Inside that portfolio was the forensic financial audit proving that the visionary tech genius sitting across from me had spent his company funds on luxury vehicles and expensive vacations. But I was not ready to open it yet. I wanted to hear the exact number. I wanted to see exactly how greedy they were going to be. The psychological trap had been fully set, and now it was time for them to make their explicit demand. My father finally finished his grand manipulative speech about family loyalty and leaned back in his chair looking thoroughly satisfied with his performance. Before I could even formulate a response to his ridiculous claims about my brother being a misunderstood visionary, Jasmine decided it was her turn to take control of the conversation. She shifted her weight in her expensive woven chair and let out a dramatic heavy sigh as if my mere presence was exhausting her. She reached up with her perfectly manicured hand and pushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. As she made the deliberate movement, the sunlight caught the stack of thick gold Cartier bracelets wrapped tightly around her wrist. They clinked together loudly, a sharp metallic sound that was meant to remind me of her supposed high social status. Jasmine always used her designer accessories as a weapon to establish dominance over people she deemed inferior. She rested her arms on the white tablecloth, leaned forward, and looked at me with an expression of pure condescending entitlement. Jasmine did not bother with the fake pleasantries my parents had attempted. She went straight for the absolute kill. She told me that she and Tyler had read the industry newsletter published that morning. She practically sneered as she mentioned my new job title, calling it a lucky break for someone who spent so much time hiding in a library. She explicitly stated that they knew all about Vertex Global and the aggressive new financial strategies the hedge fund was executing. But more importantly, she made it crystal clear that they knew the exact details of my compensation package. Jasmine looked me dead in the eyes and said the numbers out loud just to prove she had done her research. She stated that they knew I was receiving a base salary of $1,200,000 and a massive signing bonus of $6,500,000. She spoke about my money with a tone of possessive familiarity, as if my hard-earned wealth was simply a communal family jackpot that they were automatically entitled to share. I sat perfectly still, allowing her to expose the true depths of her greed. Jasmine adjusted her posture again, lifting her chin in a display of unearned arrogance. She announced that Because I had suddenly come into this massive windfall, it was my absolute duty to help her husband save his technology startup. She casually dropped the bomb without a single ounce of shame or hesitation. Jasmine demanded that I wire $2 million directly into Tyler's corporate account by the end of the business week. She used the term bridge loan, trying to make the extortion sound like a standard professional financial transaction. But the way she casually waved her hand in the air told me everything I needed to know. She had absolutely no intention of ever paying that money back. It was not a loan. It was a demand for a permanent massive cash gift to fund her luxurious lifestyle. She tried to justify the absurd number by claiming the $2 million would be used to secure new server architecture and hire top-tier software developers. I knew for an absolute fact that she was lying. I had the forensic audit sitting in the leather portfolio resting right on my lap. I knew that the money would actually go toward paying off her leased luxury vehicles, her expensive country club memberships, and her lavish vacations. Jasmine continued her relentless assault, completely unaware that she was digging an inescapable grave. She decided to employ the exact same toxic gaslighting strategy my parents had used for decades. She told me that handing over $2 million was the absolute least I could do for this family. She confidently reminded me that my mother and my father had paid for my undergraduate college degree 10 years ago. She conveniently ignored the fact that my undergraduate tuition was a fraction of what they had happily thrown away on Tyler's failed ventures. She twisted that 10-year-old financial support into a lifelong, unbreakable debt of gratitude that I was forced to repay on demand. Jasmine aggressively stated that if it were not for the foundation my parents provided, I would never have been able to get my doctoral degree or secure this lucrative new job. The sheer unmatched audacity of her words was genuinely breathtaking. She was sitting there wearing thousands of dollars worth of jewelry, bought with stolen corporate funds, demanding $2 million of my money while actively insulting my intelligence. She genuinely believed she was the smartest person sitting at the table. She looked at me with an expectant, smug expression, fully anticipating that I would crumble under the immense pressure of their combined family guilt trip. Tyler sat quietly next to her, nodding his head in agreement, letting his wife do the dirty work of extorting his own sister. My mother, Patricia, looked at Jasmine with an expression of proud approval, thrilled that someone was finally putting me in my place. They were all completely united in their delusional belief that I existed simply to serve their financial needs. I did not break eye contact with Jasmine. I absorbed every single toxic word she threw at me, feeling absolutely no anger or sorrow. Or the scared, desperate girl they once knew was completely gone. $2 million. That was the price they placed on our relationship. That was the ransom they demanded for their conditional fake love. I felt the smooth, cool leather of the financial portfolio resting heavily on my lap. The trap had been flawlessly executed, and they had stepped right into the very center of it. They had laid all their cards on the table, exposing their overwhelming greed and their profound lack of respect for me. Now, it was finally my turn to play. I took a slow, deep breath and smiled very coldly. Jasmine leaned back with a look of supreme satisfaction on her face. She believed her demand for $2 million was reasonable. She thought dropping that massive number had intimidated me into a state of stunned silence. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at her and slowly shifted my gaze toward my mother. Patricia had been quietly watching the exchange like a hawk circling its prey. When she saw I was not immediately pulling out my checkbook, she decided to step in and act as the ultimate enforcer. My mother always viewed herself as the supreme authority figure in our family dynamic. She gently placed her crystal glass of sparkling water onto the crisp white tablecloth. She adjusted the string of expensive pearls resting around her neck. It was a subtle movement she always made right before delivering a devastating blow. Patricia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and locked her piercing eyes directly onto mine. Her sickeningly sweet tone from the phone call completely evaporated. Her voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper designed to entirely terrorize me. She told me Jasmine had made a clear and generous request. Patricia stated that $2 million was an insignificant sum of money compared to the compensation package I had just received from my new job. She said because I was unmarried and had no children, I had no practical use for all of that wealth. Therefore, she concluded, the money rightfully belonged to the family unit to protect our collective legacy. She told me she and my father had spent decades building a pristine reputation in this community, and they were not going to let my brother Tyler fail simply because I was deciding to be stubborn and selfish. Patricia then raised her chin and delivered the absolute ultimatum. She told me I had exactly until 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon to wire the $2 million directly into Tyler's corporate bank account. She said if the money was not deposited by that exact deadline, she and my father were going to take immediate permanent action against me. She explicitly stated they would contact their estate lawyers on Monday morning and have me officially written out of the family trust. The family trust was something my parents constantly held over my head like a loaded weapon. For my entire life, they used the promise of a future inheritance to control my behavior, to dictate my choices, and to ensure I remained submissive to their demands. Patricia looked at me with icy conviction. She told me if I failed to save my brother, I would be entirely disowned. I would not receive a single penny from their estate. She said I would be cut off from the family bloodline forever. But my mother did not stop there. She knew threatening to take away a future inheritance might not be enough to break me. So she immediately pivoted to her absolute favorite weapon. She decided to threaten my social standing. Patricia was the undisputed queen of her wealthy suburban social circle. She wielded gossip like a highly sharpened blade. She leaned in even closer so only our table could hear her toxic words. She told me if I abandoned my brother in his absolute hour of need, she would make sure every single person of influence in our city knew exactly what kind of monster I truly was. Patricia explicitly laid out her calculated plan to destroy my reputation. She said she would tell her entire social circle I was a greedy, ungrateful daughter who turned her back on her own family the second she got a taste of corporate power. She threatened to paint Tyler as a brilliant, hardworking entrepreneur who was simply victimized by a cruel economy and frame me as the wealthy villain who watched him drown out of petty jealousy. She promised she would ruin my name in every country club, every high-end restaurant, and every social gathering in the state. She said no amount of money could ever buy back a ruined reputation, and I would end up living a lonely and miserable life, alienated from the only people who ever truly cared about me. Tyler and Richard both sat there in absolute total silence, letting Patricia deliver her harsh, ruthless psychological beating. They looked incredibly smug. They genuinely believed she had just backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought the combined threat of losing my family, losing my inheritance, and losing my social reputation would be enough to instantly break my spirit and force me to hand over my hard-earned money. They expected me to start crying. They expected me to apologize for being selfish and immediately promise to wire the funds by the Friday deadline. They were eagerly waiting for the exact moment my resolve completely shattered. I sat perfectly still in my charcoal gray suit, absorbing every single word of her vicious ultimatum. I did not blink. I did not look down. I just stared straight into my mother's cold, calculating eyes. The sheer absolute irony of her threats was almost too much for me to process. She was threatening to write me out of a family trust that was currently entirely worthless. She was threatening to withhold an inheritance that no longer existed. My parents had secretly leveraged their entire estate, including the family home and their retirement portfolios, to secure the initial venture capital loan for my brother. Because my brother had catastrophically failed and defaulted on that exact loan, my hedge fund Vertex Global now legally owned every single asset my mother was threatening to take away. Furthermore, she was threatening to destroy my reputation among the wealthy country club elite, completely unaware she was just days away from being entirely evicted from that very same social circle. Without their home and without their money, my parents would never be able to afford the membership dues at the Oak Ridge Country Club ever again. The people she planned to gossip with were going to completely abandon her the second the bank foreclosed on her sprawling suburban estate. She was sitting there acting like a powerful queen ruling over a massive financial empire, while I was literally holding the signed deed to her kingdom right in my lap. The absolute delusion radiating from my entire family was genuinely staggering. They were so blinded by their own greed and their arrogant sense of superiority, they could not see the massive guillotine hanging directly over their heads. I took a very slow and extremely quiet deep breath. I felt the smooth, cool leather of the financial portfolio resting heavily on my knees. I had let them all speak. I had let them lay out all of their demands and all of their pathetic threats. I had given them every opportunity to show me a single ounce of genuine love or respect, and they had chosen extortion instead. The ambush they had so carefully planned was now completely over. My mother sat back in her chair, crossing her arms and waiting for my final answer. It was finally my turn to speak and end this. The heavy silence hung over our corner table at the Oak Ridge Country Club. My mother Patricia had just finished delivering her grand ultimatum, threatening to disown me and destroy my reputation if I did not hand over $2 million. Jasmine was sitting next to her with a look of absolute triumph on her face, fully expecting me to surrender. Tyler and Richard were staring at me like starving wolves waiting for their meal. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own audacity. I wanted the sheer absurdity of their demands to echo in their minds. I slowly moved my right hand and picked up the crystal glass of sparkling water resting on the crisp white tablecloth. The condensation on the glass was cool against my skin. I brought the rim to my lips and took a very slow, deliberate sip. The ice gently clinked against the sides. I swallowed the cold water and carefully placed the glass back down onto the table, making sure it was perfectly centered on the small cardboard coaster. I did not look at my father or my mother. I turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto Jasmine. I looked right through her arrogant facade and stared straight into her deep, underlying insecurities. I opened my mouth and delivered a single syllable that would permanently alter the trajectory of all of our lives. No. The single word hung in the warm afternoon air like a suspended drop of poison. It took a few seconds for the reality of my refusal to actually penetrate their thick layers of entitlement. They had never heard me say that word before. For 33 years, I had been the compliant, obedient daughter who bent over backwards to keep the peace. But today, the peace was officially dead. The reaction was instantaneous and incredibly violent. The table completely exploded. Jasmine was the first to completely lose her composure. The smug, triumphant smile instantly vanished from her perfectly made-up face, replaced by an ugly, twisted sneer of pure hatred. She leaned across the table, pointing her manicured finger directly at my face. She completely abandoned her sophisticated country club persona and began to raise her voice, drawing the attention of the wealthy patrons sitting at the adjacent tables. She called me a pathetic, bitter spinster. She yelled that the only reason I was hoarding my new wealth was because I was completely alone in the world and desperately jealous of her perfect marriage. Jasmine screamed that I was a miserable woman who would never know what it was like to be truly loved by a man or to build a real family. She claimed that my refusal to give them the $2 million was just a pathetic attempt to punish Tyler for being the successful, attractive sibling who actually had a life worth living. Before Jasmine could even finish her toxic tirade, Tyler finally decided to speak up. The golden child who had been sitting quietly letting his wife and parents do all the heavy lifting suddenly erupted into a massive childish tantrum. Tyler aggressively threw his expensive linen napkin onto the table, knocking over an empty coffee cup. He leaned forward, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. He started shouting about how incredibly selfish I was. He completely ignored the fact that he had squandered $5 million of venture capital on luxury cars and lavish vacations. Instead, he painted himself as the ultimate victim of my supposed cruelty. Tyler yelled that he had worked his fingers to the bone building his software company from the ground up, and that I was trying to destroy his absolute dream just out of pure spite. He demanded to know how I could sit there in my fancy new corporate job and watch my own flesh and blood lose everything they had worked so hard for. He told me I was a traitor to the family. He said that I had absolutely no idea what it took to be a real entrepreneur and that I was just a glorified calculator who got lucky with a single algorithm. Tyler accused me of trying to sabotage his entire future because I could not handle the fact that he was the favorite child. The sheer volume of Tyler's shouting was escalating the situation into a full-blown public spectacle. My mother, Patricia, looked around the outdoor terrace, her eyes wide with sudden panic as she realized that several of her wealthy friends were openly staring at our table. She tried to shush Tyler, but he was too far gone in his self-righteous rage. That was when my father Richard decided he had taken enough of my disrespect. He could not handle the fact that his ultimate authority was being challenged in a public setting. Richard stood up halfway from his chair and slammed his heavy fist down onto the table with terrifying force. The loud, violent crack echoed across the entire dining patio. Silverware jumped off the tablecloth, and a glass of water tipped over, spilling cold liquid across the white fabric. The entire country club went completely silent. Waiters stopped in their tracks. Conversations at nearby tables abruptly ceased. Richard leaned over the spilled water, his face contorted with absolute fury. The veins in his neck were visibly bulging. He pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded that I show some respect. He used his deepest, most threatening voice, telling me that I was acting like an ungrateful brat and that he would not tolerate this kind of blatant disobedience in his presence. I sat perfectly still in the very center of their absolute chaos. The spilled water from my father's sudden violent outburst was slowly inching closer to my side of the table, but I did not even bother to move out of the way. I simply sat and watched the three of them absolutely unravel. I watched Jasmine's face flushed with venom. I watched my father Richard's toxic authoritarian rage. They had completely lost control of their emotions, and they had completely lost control of me. The wealthy patrons of the Oak Ridge Country Club were watching the wealthy facade of the Richard family crumble in real time. I felt absolutely zero emotion, just a cold, clinical satisfaction. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against their vicious insults. I did not try to explain my reasoning or argue about who was truly being selfish. Words were entirely useless against people who were committed to their own delusions. Instead, I broke eye contact with my raging father and slowly lowered my gaze to my lap. I placed my hands on the thick black leather portfolio, resting securely on my knees. I calmly popped open the dual metal clasps and reached inside the dark interior. I grasped the thick stack of printed financial documents, holding the absolute undeniable truth of my brother's profound corporate failure. I prepared to deliver the very first lethal strike against their entire foundation. I was ready to burn their illusions to ash. The time for talking was officially over. The spilled water from my father's violent outburst continued to slowly spread across the crisp white tablecloth. It soaked into the expensive linen, inching closer to my side of the table. Richard was still standing halfway out of his chair, breathing heavily with his face flushed red with absolute rage. Jasmine was crossing her arms tightly, wearing a twisted expression of deep disgust. Tyler was glaring at me, fully expecting me to finally break down and apologize for being so incredibly selfish. They were all waiting for my complete surrender. But I did not surrender. I did not even blink. I simply lowered my gaze away from my father's furious eyes and looked down at my lap. The thick black leather portfolio rested securely against my knees. I reached down and placed both of my hands on the smooth surface. The dual metal clasps made a sharp clicking sound as I popped them open. The sudden noise was incredibly loud in the heavy silence of the country club terrace. I reached inside the dark interior of the portfolio and gripped the thick stack of premium printed paper. It was the complete forensic financial audit and the officially finalized liquidation file for Apex Solutions. I carefully pulled the heavy stack of documents out of the portfolio and brought them up to the table. I placed the papers down right on the edge of the dry tablecloth, deliberately avoiding the spreading puddle of spilled water. My family watched my every single movement with deep confusion. They did not know what I was doing. My mother, Patricia, narrowed her eyes, leaning forward slightly to try and read the text on the front page. She probably thought I was pulling out a massive contract to secure my own financial interests before handing over the $2 million. My father, Richard, slowly lowered himself back into his chair, adjusting his suit jacket with a smug expression. He clearly assumed that his aggressive outburst had successfully intimidated me, and that these papers were the preliminary steps to a bank transfer. Tyler let out a loud, arrogant sigh of relief, running his hand through his hair. He looked at Jasmine and offered her a small, victorious smile. They genuinely believed that I was about to give them exactly what they wanted. I rested my hand flat on top of the documents. The paper was still slightly warm from the corporate printers at the Vertex Global headquarters. I looked directly at Tyler, making sure I had his complete and undivided attention. I applied a small amount of pressure to the top of the stack and slowly pushed the documents across the center of the table. The thick stack of paper made a soft brushing sound as it slid across the white linen, stopping exactly an inch away from Tyler's empty coffee cup. Tyler looked down at the documents and then looked back up at me with a questioning expression. He asked me what this was. He told me that he did not have time to read through complicated legal terms and that I just needed to tell him when the $2 million transfer would be completed. I kept my voice perfectly level and incredibly calm. I told Tyler that there was not going to be a bank transfer. I told him that I did not need to give him a $2 million bridge loan. Jasmine immediately bristled, opening her mouth to start shouting again, but I held up my hand and silenced her with a single sharp look. I turned my attention back to my brother. I instructed him to look at the massive, bold heading printed at the very top of the first page. Tyler reluctantly lowered his eyes and began to read. I did not wait for him to finish. I spoke the words out loud so my parents and his arrogant wife could hear every single devastating detail. I explained that 2 days ago, the sophisticated algorithms at my new firm, Vertex Global, had flagged a massive bundle of toxic, distressed assets. I told them that the original venture capital firm that had loaned Tyler the $5 million to start his company had completely panicked. They saw his catastrophic financial mismanagement and realized he was never going to pay them back. So they decided to cut their massive losses and sell the entire debt package to the highest bidder. I watched the color completely drain out of Tyler's face as my words slowly began to register in his brain. I continued my explanation with ruthless precision. I told him that Vertex Global had purchased his entire $5 million corporate debt for pennies on the dollar. We bought the entire package for exactly $1 million. And because Vertex Global now owned his debt, we also legally owned all of the collateral tied to his failing software company. Tyler started shaking his head back and forth, rapidly whispering that this was impossible. He said that his original lenders would never sell his debt without notifying him first. I told him he should have actually read the fine print in his original corporate contract before signing his life away. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I instructed Tyler to flip to the third page of the document and look at the bottom right corner. His hands were physically trembling as he reached out and turned the heavy pages. He stared down at the signature line. I told him to read the name of the executive director who was currently managing the distressed assets division for Vertex Global. I told him to read the name of the person who now legally held the exclusive rights to his entire company. Tyler stared at the signature line and his mouth fell slightly open. He saw my name printed in stark black ink right next to the official corporate seal of a $12 billion hedge fund. The realization hit him like a massive runaway freight train. He slowly looked up from the paper and stared at me with an expression of pure, absolute horror. The arrogant, entitled golden child was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified little boy who suddenly realized he was entirely at the mercy of the sister he had spent his whole life treating like absolute garbage. Jasmine looked at her husband with deep confusion. She aggressively grabbed the papers out of his hands and started scanning the text herself. She did not fully understand the complex financial jargon, but she clearly recognized my name printed on the creditor line. She asked Tyler what this meant. She demanded that he explain it to her. Tyler could barely form a coherent sentence. He just kept staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I decided to explain it to her myself. I looked right at Jasmine and smiled a very cold, calculating smile. I told her it meant that her husband was no longer the owner of Apex Solutions. It meant that I was officially and legally his primary creditor. I owned his massive corporate debt package. I owned his failing company software. And I legally owned him right now. Tyler sat frozen in his expensive woven chair, staring at my name printed on the creditor line. His mouth opened and closed several times like a suffocating fish, but no actual words came out. He was frantically searching his brain for a convenient lie or a manipulative excuse that could somehow explain away the fact that his entire company was now legally owned by his older sister. My father Richard finally broke out of his stunned silence. He shook his head stubbornly, refusing to accept the reality sitting right in front of him. Richard aggressively stated that there must be some kind of massive clerical error. He insisted that a prestigious venture capital firm would never secretly sell off the debt of a highly promising tech startup without giving the founder a chance to negotiate. My mother, Patricia, eagerly nodded along, desperately clinging to her husband's denial. She looked at me with a nervous, trembling smile and suggested that my new company had simply made a mistake. Tyler eagerly latched onto this lifeline. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain his shattered confidence. He pointed a shaking finger at me and loudly declared that I was a low-level employee who did not understand corporate acquisitions. He told me that his company was on the verge of a massive software breakthrough and that his original investors were fully supportive of his long-term vision. He actually tried to convince the table that the document sitting in front of him was meaningless. I did not argue with his pathetic delusions. I simply let him finish his desperate lie before I delivered the next devastating blow. I kept my eyes locked on his pale, sweating face as I reached my hand back into the dark interior of my black leather portfolio. My fingers grazed the thick, glossy cover of the second document. I pulled it out and placed it gently on top of the crisp, white tablecloth directly next to the restructured debt agreement. This document was bound in a bright red cover, indicating its highly sensitive nature. I looked at Tyler and told him that my hedge fund did not make clerical errors. I explained that before Vertex Global spent a single dollar acquiring a distressed asset, our quantitative analysts performed a rigorous forensic financial audit. I told him that we tracked every single penny that went in and out of his corporate bank accounts for the last 24 months. I rested my hand flat against the red cover. I told the table that I knew exactly why his original investors had completely panicked. I knew exactly why they had aggressively sold his debt for pennies on the dollar. I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the anticipation build. Then I pushed the red folder across the table until it gently bumped against his empty coffee cup. I told Tyler that his investors did not sell his debt because the market was unfair. They sold his debt because he was actively committing massive corporate fraud. The word fraud hung heavily in the air, silencing my father's protests. Tyler's face went completely ashen. He looked at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake about to strike him. I did not wait for him to open it. I knew the numbers perfectly by heart. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting my words so Jasmine and my parents could hear every single undeniable fact. I started with the core lie. I reminded the table that just 10 minutes ago, Jasmine had demanded a $2 million bridge loan, claiming the money was desperately needed to hire top-tier software developers and secure new server architecture. I looked directly at Jasmine and told her that her husband had never hired a single top-tier software developer in his entire life. I recited the exact financial data from the forensic audit. I explained that out of the initial $5 million venture capital loan, Tyler had spent less than $200,000 on actual software engineering. I revealed that he had outsourced the entire development process to a cheap, unverified overseas agency, resulting in a completely broken application that was fundamentally unusable. He had no product. He had no users. He had no revenue. He had built an absolute phantom company solely designed to siphon millions of dollars from oblivious investors. Jasmine's arrogant facade began to visibly crack. She looked at Tyler, expecting him to vehemently deny my accusations, but Tyler was completely silent, staring down at the red folder in pure terror. I turned my full attention to Jasmine. I decided it was time to address her deeply entitled lifestyle. I asked her how she thought Tyler was funding her glamorous online persona. I told her I had seen her lifestyle blog filled with pictures of luxury dinners, designer clothes, and expensive spa days. I recited the exact dates and amounts of the fraudulent transactions. I told the table that Tyler had illegally used his corporate business account to pay for a $60,000 long-term lease on Jasmine's luxury Mercedes G-Wagon. I watched Jasmine's eyes widen in absolute shock as I exposed her stolen wealth. I detailed the thousands of dollars expensed at high-end steakhouses and exclusive rooftop bars, falsely categorized as client acquisition meetings. I explained that every single time Jasmine posted a picture of herself living a life of absolute luxury, she was actively documenting her husband's corporate embezzlement. Jasmine's perfectly manicured hands began to physically shake. The loud, arrogant woman who had just called me a bitter spinster went completely dead silent. She realized that her entire identity was built on stolen money and that the true owner of that money was sitting right across the table from her. I was not finished dismantling their false reality. My father Richard was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. Patricia held her hand over her mouth, staring at her golden child with dawning horror. They had blindly believed in his genius, and now they were being forced to look at his undeniable criminality. I delivered the final nail into his fake empire. I looked at my parents and asked them if they remembered the beautiful ski chalet in Aspen, where Tyler and Jasmine had spent 3 weeks last winter. Patricia nodded, looking confused. I told her that Tyler had told everyone the trip was a corporate retreat, paid for by his generous board of directors. I smiled coldly and shattered that lie. I revealed that Tyler had secretly used $400,000 of company funds to purchase an exclusive luxury timeshare in the mountains. He had literally stolen almost $500,000 of investor money to buy himself a winter playground. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the four of them sitting in absolute stunned silence. I told Tyler that his company was nothing more than a personal piggy bank used to fund a life he absolutely did not deserve. I told him that the forensic audit proved he had committed gross financial misconduct and massive fraud. The golden child was exposed as a common thief, and I was the one holding the undeniable proof right now. The heavy silence was absolutely deafening. I sat completely still in my charcoal gray suit, watching my family process the devastating reality of the red folder. My brother Tyler was staring at the forensic audit like a condemned man looking at a sudden execution order. My father Richard had finally stopped trying to defend him. The irrefutable proof of corporate embezzlement was impossible to argue against. Jasmine was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were entirely white. The luxurious lifestyle she had constantly rubbed in my face was officially exposed as a criminal fantasy built on stolen investor funds. But I was not quite finished. Exposing the fraud was only the preliminary step. It was time to deliver the final lethal blow to my brother's fragile ego and fake corporate identity. I reached out and opened the original black leather portfolio one last time. I slipped my fingers beneath the red forensic audit and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored parchment paper. It was the official legal decree from Vertex Global. I held the document up so the bright afternoon sunlight caught the raised gold seal. I looked directly into Tyler's terrified eyes and told him his reckless spending had triggered legal consequences. Tyler tried to open his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. I placed the cream-colored paper directly in front of him, resting it right on top of the forensic audit. I kept my voice perfectly calm. I told my family that when Vertex Global purchased the $5 million debt package, we also inherited the original loan covenants. I explained that a loan covenant is a strict set of financial rules that a borrower must completely obey to maintain control of their company. I told them that because Tyler had missed 3 consecutive interest payments, and because our audit proved he had used corporate funds for personal luxury expenses, he was in massive violation of his contract. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white tablecloth, and locked my eyes onto his pale, sweating face. I told Tyler that because of his extreme financial negligence, Vertex Global had the absolute legal right to instantly trigger the master default clause. My mother, Patricia, let out a soft, whimpering sound. She finally realized that the son she had idolized her entire life had completely ruined himself beyond any possible repair. Richard stared at the document, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might break. They were completely powerless. They could not yell or scream or bully their way out of this situation. I was holding a legally binding contract backed by a $12 billion financial institution. I pointed my index finger at the bold black text printed. I told Tyler that he did not have time to read the legal jargon, so I was going to read it out loud for everyone at the table to hear. I cleared my throat and recited the exact wording of the corporate execution. As the majority debt holder of Apex Solutions, Vertex Global has exercised its legal right to immediately dissolve the current executive board of directors. I paused, letting the immense weight of the word dissolve sink deeply into his panicked brain. Then I delivered the absolute crushing blow. I told Tyler that he was officially terminated from his position as the chief executive officer. I looked at my expensive designer watch and noted the time. I told him that his termination was not pending or negotiable. I told him that his firing was executed at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Tyler let out a loud, choking gasp. He grabbed the edges of his expensive linen shirt, pulling at the fabric as if it were suddenly strangling him. Jasmine covered her mouth with her manicured hand, her eyes wide with absolute horror. The title of Chief Executive Officer was the only thing Tyler actually cared about. It was the title he used to impress women to lease expensive cars and to make my parents incredibly proud. Now that title was completely gone, stripped away by the older sister he had constantly belittled. Tyler started shaking his head back and forth, his breathing becoming incredibly rapid and shallow. He managed to force a few desperate words out of his tight throat. He claimed that I could not do this to him. He stammered that his personal files and all of his private contacts were still on his company computer. He told me he needed to go back to his luxury office in Boston to collect his things and call his corporate lawyers to fight this hostile takeover. I smiled a very cold and terrifying smile. I told him that there was absolutely no reason for him to travel back to Boston. I explained that when the default clause was triggered at 8 o'clock this morning, my hedge fund immediately dispatched a specialized team of corporate security officers and forensic data analysts directly to his headquarters. I told him that the glass doors of his expensive office space had already been permanently padlocked by building management. I watched the last remaining drop of hope completely vanish from his eyes as I continued. I told Tyler that all of the company laptops, the server racks, and the secure hard drives had already been physically seized by my security team and transported to a secure vault. I told him his corporate email account was permanently disabled and his access badges were completely deactivated. He was entirely locked out of the company he founded. He had absolutely nothing left, not a single file, not a single dollar, not a single ounce of authority. The magnitude of his destruction finally crushed him. Tyler leaned forward and grabbed his chest. He began to violently hyperventilate. His chest heaved as he desperately tried to pull oxygen into his lungs. He was having a massive panic attack in the middle of the country club. The wealthy patrons at nearby tables were openly pointing and whispering, watching the golden boy completely fall apart in front of his family. Patricia jumped out of her chair, knocking her glass of sparkling water onto the ground. The glass shattered loudly against the stone patio. She rushed over to Tyler, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders. She frantically rubbed his back, begging him to breathe and telling him everything would be okay. Richard just sat there staring at the legal documents with a look of absolute defeat etched into his face. Jasmine pushed her chair away from the table, trying to distance herself from the humiliating public spectacle. She looked at me with an expression of pure, terrified awe. She finally understood that I was not a bitter spinster seeking petty revenge. I was a highly calculated predator who had just completely consumed their entire fake empire without breaking a single sweat. I sat perfectly still watching my brother gasp for air. I felt absolutely no pity for his suffering. I felt absolutely no guilt for destroying his fraudulent life. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of their lifelong arrogance play out exactly as I had planned. The panic attack unfolded right in front of me. Tyler was still gasping for air while my mother Patricia hovered over him frantically whispering empty reassurances. Jasmine had completely detached herself, staring blankly at the white tablecloth. But the initial shock paralyzing my father Richard finally wore off. It was replaced by explosive anger. Richard had spent his entire life bullying people into submission. He was obsessed with his own authority and the illusion of absolute control. Seeing his golden child humiliated and stripped of his power was a direct assault on his own massive ego. He could not process that the daughter he treated with profound disrespect was the architect of this destruction. His face turned a deep, terrifying shade of purple. The thick veins on his forehead pulsed violently. He pushed his heavy chair backward so hard it scraped loudly against the stone patio, causing the wealthy patrons to flinch. He stood up to his full height, attempting to use physical size to intimidate me like he had done throughout my childhood. He slammed his hands flat on the table, leaning his upper body toward me until his face was inches away. His breath was ragged and heavy with pure rage. He instantly began to scream. He abandoned any remaining shred of his dignified country club persona. His deep voice boomed across the outdoor terrace filled with venom. He demanded that I immediately reverse the corporate seizure. He ordered me to call my security team and give Tyler his company back right this second. He spoke to me as if I were a disobedient child who had simply taken a toy from her brother. He ignored the reality of the legally binding financial documents under his hands. He refused to acknowledge the $5 million corporate debt or the massive fraud Tyler had committed. Inside his completely distorted reality, I was just a vindictive sister throwing a temper tantrum. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I sat perfectly upright in my tailored charcoal gray suit, looking directly into his furious eyes. My silence only fueled his aggressive rage. When he realized that shouting orders at me was not going to work, he immediately pivoted to his ultimate weapon. He decided to threaten me with severe legal and professional destruction. Richard pointed his thick finger right at my face and unleashed a torrent of vicious legal threats. He screamed that he was going to hire the absolute best corporate litigation lawyers in the entire state. He told me he was going to file a massive lawsuit against me and against Vertex Global for hostile takeover practices and malicious financial targeting. He confidently declared that he would drag my hedge fund through years of exhausting litigation until they were forced to fire me just to save their own reputation. He threatened to call the financial regulatory agencies and accuse me of utilizing unethical insider information to destroy my own family member. He yelled that he was going to make sure I was permanently blacklisted from the entire financial industry. He promised me that by the time his lawyers were finished with me, I would be completely bankrupt and begging for a minimum wage job. He said I had made the biggest mistake of my entire life by deciding to cross him. He actually believed his own arrogant lies. He believed that his aggressive blustering could somehow magically erase a legally binding corporate acquisition executed by a $12 billion financial institution. My mother Patricia immediately jumped in to support his vicious tirade. She stopped rubbing his back and turned her tear-stained face toward me. Her voice was shaking with dramatic performative outrage. She yelled that I was a completely unnatural daughter. She asked how I could possibly be so cruel and heartless to my own flesh and blood. She accused me of meticulously plotting this entire situation just to satisfy my own petty jealousy. She claimed that I had deliberately targeted Tyler because I could not stand the fact that he was happier and more successful than I was. Patricia told me that if I did not fix this right now, the family would not just disown me, they would completely destroy me just like my father promised. They were completely united in their toxic delusion. They genuinely thought that combining their anger and throwing around massive legal threats would finally break my unyielding composure. They expected me to panic. They expected me to realize that I had gone too far and that the consequences of my actions were going to ruin my perfectly structured new life. They were waiting for me to suddenly beg for their forgiveness. I sat quietly and let the echoes of their screaming fade into the warm afternoon air. The entire dining patio was completely silent, every single patron watching our table in absolute shock. I looked at my father. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion from his aggressive screaming fit. He looked so incredibly proud of himself, thoroughly convinced that his terrifying performance had successfully put me right back in my designated place. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt absolutely no regret. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity for his spectacular ignorance. I looked down at the spilled water on the table, then slowly brought my eyes back up to meet his furious gaze. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream back. I kept my tone perfectly level, freezing cold, and completely merciless. I asked him how exactly he planned to hire the best corporate lawyers in the state. I asked him how he planned to fund a massive, multi-year litigation battle against a $12 billion hedge fund. Richard glared at me, opening his mouth to proudly declare his wealth, but I cut him off before he could even speak. I tilted my head, slightly narrowed my eyes, and asked the final fatal question. "With what money, Dad?" My father Richard stared at me with his mouth slightly open. The furious red color of his face slowly began to fade, giving way to a pale and sickly gray. My simple question hung in the warm air, completely shattering the momentum of his aggressive legal threats. "With what money, Dad?" He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He looked nervously at my mother Patricia, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. They had spent my entire life pretending to have an endless supply of generational wealth, but I knew the exact truth. I did not wait for him to formulate a pathetic lie. I slowly reached my hand back into the dark interior of the black leather portfolio, resting on my lap for the very last time. My fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the crisp white tablecloth, directly next to the red forensic audit. I kept my movements incredibly slow and deliberate, ensuring that every single eye at the table was completely fixated on the envelope. I popped open the metal clasp and pulled out two distinct pieces of high-quality parchment paper. One was a legally registered property deed, and the other was a massive financial lien. I looked directly at my father and smiled a very cold and terrifying smile. I told him that I knew exactly how Tyler had managed to secure his initial $5 million venture capital loan. I explained that a newly formed tech startup with absolutely zero revenue and a completely inexperienced founder does not just walk into a major financial institution and walk out with $5 million. I told the table that the bank required a massive amount of collateral to guarantee the incredibly risky loan. Tyler looked down at the table, completely unable to meet my gaze. I turned my attention back to my parents. I told them I knew that 2 years ago, they had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on their sprawling suburban colonial house. I recited the exact date of the transaction and the exact dollar amount they had borrowed against their own home. Patricia let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with both of her hands. But I was not finished exposing their financial ruin. I pointed to the second document sitting on the table. I told them I also knew they had quietly pledged their entire joint retirement portfolio as secondary collateral to cover the rest of Tyler's massive corporate loan. They had literally gambled their entire life savings and the roof over their heads on my brother's completely fraudulent software company. The absolute silence on the outdoor terrace was deafening. Jasmine looked at her parents-in-law with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the endless well of money she thought she had married into was completely dry. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I kept my voice perfectly level, making sure they heard every single devastating syllable. I told Richard that he was not going to hire the best corporate lawyers in the state to sue me because he literally did not have a single dollar left to his name. I explained the basic legal mechanics of a cross-default clause. I told my parents that when Tyler missed his 3 consecutive interest payments and triggered the master default clause on his venture capital loan, that default automatically extended to their secondary collateral. Because Vertex Global had aggressively purchased the entire debt package, Vertex Global now legally held the exclusive rights to both the second mortgage on their home and their fully pledged retirement portfolio. I watched the profound, horrific realization wash over my father's face. The arrogant patriarch who had just spent the last 5 minutes screaming at me and threatening to destroy my entire career suddenly realized he was completely and utterly bankrupt. I pointed my index finger directly at the property deed sitting on the white tablecloth. I told my parents that they did not own their beautiful brick colonial house anymore. I told them that my hedge fund owned it. I pointed to the financial lien and told them that their retirement accounts were currently frozen and would be entirely liquidated by the end of the business week to cover my brother's massive corporate embezzlement. I told Richard that his country club dues were going to bounce next month. I told Patricia that the wealthy social circle she planned to gossip with was going to completely cast her out the second they realized she was completely broke. They had spent my entire life calling me a failure and treating me like an unwanted burden while they handed everything to my brother. They had blindly enabled his absolute worst behaviors and funded his pathetic illusions of grandeur. And in doing so, they had completely destroyed themselves. My father collapsed heavily back into his chair, as if all the bones in his body had suddenly turned to dust. His chest heaved, but he could not speak. The intimidating authoritarian figure was completely gone, replaced by a broken, exhausted old man. Patricia was openly sobbing, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out with a trembling hand, trying to touch my arm, but I immediately pulled away, disgusted by her sudden display of weakness. They had expected me to be their financial savior. They had expected me to hand over $2 million just to protect their precious golden child from the consequences of his own actions. Instead, they had walked right into a flawlessly executed legal trap that stripped them of every single asset they possessed. I sat perfectly still in my tailored charcoal gray suit, completely untouched by their massive emotional breakdown. I held their entire lives in the palm of my hand, and I felt absolutely no obligation to save them from this beautiful and completely perfect disaster. The profound silence that settled over the Oak Ridge Country Club patio was entirely different from the silence just 10 minutes earlier. Before, they had been quiet out of arrogant expectation, waiting for me to surrender. Now they were completely mute because their entire universe had just violently collapsed. The aggressive, authoritarian energy that had fueled my father's vicious screaming fit was entirely evaporated. Richard sat slumped in his expensive chair, looking remarkably small. His broad shoulders were hunched forward and his eyes were fixed blankly on the crisp white tablecloth. The terrifying patriarch who had threatened to destroy my career with high-powered corporate lawyers was entirely gone. He was replaced by a broken, bankrupt man who suddenly realized he could not even afford to pay for the glass of sparkling water he had just shattered on the stone patio. Jasmine was the first person to break the heavy, suffocating silence. The realization that she was no longer married to a wealthy tech entrepreneur hit her with brutal force. She turned her head and looked at Tyler with an expression of absolute disgust. She did not offer him any comfort. She did not reach out to hold his hand or tell him they would get through this tragedy together as a married couple. Instead, she aggressively grabbed his arm and shook him. She demanded that he fix this situation immediately. Jasmine raised her voice, her tone sharp and desperate. She told Tyler that she did not sign up to live in a tiny rented apartment, and she certainly did not marry him to be publicly humiliated. She ordered him to talk to his investors, to call his lawyers, and to find a way to get her luxury car back before her lifestyle blog followers found out the truth. Tyler just sat there staring at the red forensic audit, completely unresponsive. He had absolutely no power left to fix anything, and Jasmine finally saw him for the pathetic fraud he truly was. The grand illusion of their perfect, wealthy marriage was shattering right in front of my eyes. My mother, Patricia, watched Jasmine's vicious reaction and suddenly realized that Tyler was entirely useless. The golden child could not save them. Her sprawling, suburban colonial house and her comfortable retirement portfolio were currently resting entirely in my hands. Patricia looked away from Tyler and turned her tear-stained face toward me. I watched her completely abandon 33 years of toxic favoritism in a matter of seconds. The aggressive woman who had just threatened to disown me and destroy my social reputation instantly transformed into a desperate pleading victim. Patricia leaned across the table, her eyes wide and overflowing with heavy tears. She forced a wet, pathetic smile onto her face. Her voice trembled as she spoke, adopting a sickeningly sweet tone that made my stomach completely turn. She called me her brilliant and beautiful daughter. She actually used those exact words. She told me she was so incredibly proud of the amazing corporate executive I had become. Patricia frantically started rewriting history right there at the table. She claimed that she and my father had always known I was destined for absolute greatness. She told me that they had been tough on me growing up only because they wanted to push me to reach my full potential. She said that this massive corporate acquisition was proof of my absolute genius. Then she reached both of her trembling hands across the table, completely ignoring the spilled water. She lunged forward, trying to grab my hands to establish a physical, emotional connection. She begged me to show them mercy. She pleaded with me to release the lien on their house and give Tyler another chance to make things right. She cried that we were a family and that families always forgive each other. As her hands reached toward mine, I did not hesitate for a single second. I physically recoiled, pulling my arms back and folding them tightly across my chest. I built an unbreakable wall of solid ice between us. Her desperate hands grasped at empty air before falling awkwardly onto the wet tablecloth. I looked at her with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for her theatrical tears. I told her not to touch me. My voice was incredibly cold and completely devoid of any emotion. I told Patricia that she did not get to call me her brilliant daughter today. I told her she did not get to pretend she was proud of my success only when she realized she desperately needed my money to survive. I looked at the four of them sitting around the table, completely broken and terrified. I took a slow, deep breath and looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes. I told her I wanted to remind her of something she wrote to me exactly 1 week ago. I recited the exact text message she had sent me while I was sitting alone in my university auditorium, waiting for my name to be called. I spoke the words slowly and clearly, ensuring the memory burned itself into her mind. I said you told me that you could not make it to my graduation because Tyler's app launch party was more important and he needed your support. I paused, watching her face crumble as she recognized her own cruel words. I continued reciting the message. I said you told me that getting another pointless degree at 33 years old was not an achievement. You told me to grow up and get a real job. I let her own vicious words echo across the silent patio. I told Patricia that I had followed her advice perfectly. I told her I had grown up and gotten a very real job liquidating toxic corporate assets. The time for begging was officially over. The boundary I had just drawn was made of completely solid, unbreakable concrete. They were trapped. I looked at my mother sitting there with her hands awkwardly resting on the wet tablecloth. Her tears meant absolutely nothing to me. They were not tears of genuine regret for the decades of emotional abuse she had put me through. They were simply tears of profound panic because her luxurious lifestyle was evaporating right in front of her eyes. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. I was done talking. I smoothed down the front of my charcoal gray designer suit, making sure every single crease was perfectly aligned. I looked down at the four people who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small. Now they were the ones who looked absolutely tiny. My brother Tyler was still taking shallow, panicked breaths, staring blankly at the red folder containing his fraudulent financial records. Jasmine had completely scooted her chair away from him, treating him like he was entirely infected with a highly contagious disease. My father Richard was slumped forward, his previous violent rage completely extinguished by the sudden horrifying reality of his massive bankruptcy. I picked up my black leather portfolio and securely closed the dual metal clasps. The loud, sharp clicking sound made my mother physically jump. I looked directly at Richard and delivered my final instructions. I kept my voice perfectly level, speaking with the detached authority of a corporate liquidator. I told him that because the default clause had been officially executed this morning, the legal foreclosure process on their suburban house had already begun. I told my father that he and Patricia had exactly 30 days to pack up their belongings and permanently vacate the property. My mother let out another loud, dramatic sob, covering her face with her hands. I ignored her completely. I told Richard that if they were not completely moved out by the end of the 30-day period, my security team would arrive with local law enforcement to physically remove them from the premises. I explained that they needed to leave the house in pristine condition because my hedge fund would be listing it on the real estate market immediately to begin recouping the massive millions of dollars Tyler had stolen. I told them they needed to cancel their expensive country club memberships right now before the monthly dues bounced and caused them even more public humiliation. I looked at Jasmine and suggested she start looking for a real job because her stolen luxury vehicle was going to be repossessed by tomorrow morning. Jasmine stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, her mouth hanging slightly open. She did not say a single word. She knew I held all the cards, and she knew her fake online empire was entirely dead. I turned my attention away from my broken family and looked across the outdoor dining patio. I made brief eye contact with the country club manager, whom I had discreetly spoken to and tipped generously right before I walked outside. He had been standing near the terrace doors observing the entire dramatic spectacle unfold. I gave him a small, subtle nod. He immediately understood the signal. He gestured to our designated waiter, who was holding a sleek black leather check presenter. The smartly dressed waiter quickly navigated through the tables and approached our tense group. The wealthy patrons sitting around us leaned in closer, trying to catch every single detail of the downfall happening right in front of them. The waiter stopped right next to my father. He gently placed the black leather booklet directly onto the crisp white tablecloth, sliding it right in front of Richard's defeated face. I looked down at my father and smiled a cold smile. I told him that I had originally planned to pay for the lunch today. I told him I had fully intended to cover the cost of the expensive steaks, the imported wines, and the fancy appetizers they had ordered. But I told him that since he had just spent the last 20 minutes screaming at me, calling me a bitter spinster and threatening to destroy my professional career with corporate lawyers, I decided it was best to let the patriarch of the family handle the check. I told him the total bill was $1,200. I watched my father's eyes move from the red financial audit sitting on the table to the black leather check presenter resting right next to it. He stared at the leather booklet as if it were a bomb. He knew that his credit cards were tied directly to the accounts my hedge fund had just frozen. He knew that if he handed the waiter his platinum card, it would be immediately declined in front of the entire Oak Ridge Country Club. He was trapped in an inescapable nightmare of his own making. I did not wait to watch him attempt to pay the massive bill. I had delivered the ultimate final blow, and my presence was no longer required. I turned my back on my parents, on my brother, and on his greedy wife. I did not say goodbye. I walked away from the table with my head held high, my designer heels clicking against the stone patio. I could feel the gaze of every person in the dining room watching me as I moved toward the exit. They had just witnessed a masterclass in financial destruction, and they were mesmerized. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of my family breaking down. I heard my mother sobbing. I heard Jasmine yelling at Tyler, demanding to know what he was going to do to fix her ruined life. I heard the waiter asking my father for a form of payment, but their voices grew fainter with every step I took. I pushed open the glass doors of the country club and stepped out into the beautiful afternoon sunlight. The suffocating weight I had carried for my life was gone. I was finally free. Walking out of the Oak Ridge Country Club was the most liberating moment of my life. But the emotional victory on the outdoor terrace was only the very beginning. Over the next few weeks, the relentless legal machinery of Vertex Global was fully unleashed. There were no second chances and absolutely no family discounts. The legal bloodbath was swift, practical, and entirely merciless. The first casualty of my corporate takeover was Jasmine and her meticulously curated online aesthetic. Just 2 days after our disastrous family lunch, Jasmine desperately tried to maintain her wealthy facade. She decided to go live on her social media account to complain to her thousands of followers about toxic family members who were trying to sabotage her peace. She was sitting right in the driver's seat of her luxury Mercedes G-Wagon, parked in the driveway of her upscale Boston rental. She was wearing her Cartier bracelets and sipping an expensive iced coffee, pretending everything was perfectly fine. But because Vertex Global had officially terminated Tyler's corporate lease agreements, the repossession orders had been expedited. Right in the middle of her live broadcast, a massive heavy-duty tow truck pulled into her driveway. Her followers watched in real time as two large repo men in high-visibility vests walked up to the vehicle. Jasmine completely lost her sophisticated persona. She started screaming at the men, telling them they were ruining her broadcast and that her husband was a tech chief executive officer. The repo men did not care about her follower count. They calmly informed her that the vehicle belonged to a liquidated corporate entity and ordered her to step out of the car immediately. She refused and locked the doors, throwing a massive temper tantrum. The men simply hooked the G-Wagon up to the tow rig and started lifting the front wheels off the ground while she was still sitting inside. Realizing she had absolutely no choice, Jasmine scrambled out of the car, humiliated and crying as her viewers flooded the comment section with mocking emojis. Her stolen luxury lifestyle was completely dismantled live on the internet, and she was forced to delete all of her social media accounts by the end of the day to escape the massive public embarrassment. While Jasmine was mourning the loss of her social media career, my brother Tyler was facing a much darker and far more severe reality. He had assumed that losing his company and his title was the absolute worst punishment he could possibly face. He was completely wrong. When Vertex Global acquired Apex Solutions and conducted the forensic financial audit, we did not just keep those devastating findings to ourselves. Corporate embezzlement and the misuse of venture capital funds are serious federal offenses. As a highly regulated $12 billion hedge fund, Vertex Global was legally obligated to report any uncovered criminal activity to the authorities. By the end of the week, the Internal Revenue Service and federal financial regulators had officially opened a massive joint investigation into Tyler and his fraudulent business practices. Federal agents arrived at his Boston apartment with thick stacks of subpoenas. They froze his personal bank accounts and seized every single financial document he possessed. The audit revealed the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had illegally transferred to pay for the Aspen ski chalet and the endless luxury dinners. Tyler was officially charged with tax evasion, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The golden child who had spent his entire life being praised for his non-existent genius was now sitting across from federal prosecutors desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal to avoid spending a decade in a federal prison. He could not afford a high-priced defense attorney because all of his assets were seized. He was assigned an exhausted public defender who told him his best option was absolute cooperation. The tech industry completely blacklisted him. Every single investor and business contact he had ever made permanently blocked his number. Tyler was completely stripped of his arrogant pride and forced to accept the horrifying reality that he was nothing more than a common criminal who had destroyed his own life through pure, unadulterated greed. The destruction of my brother was entirely his own fault, but the absolute downfall of my parents was a tragedy they had actively volunteered for. They had gambled their entire financial security on the golden child, and the house always wins. The 30-day eviction notice I had delivered at the country club was strictly enforced by the Property Management Division of Vertex Global. My parents desperately tried to secure a loan to save their beautiful, sprawling colonial house, but no bank in the country would lend money to people with a frozen retirement portfolio and a defaulted second mortgage. Exactly 30 days later, my father Richard and my mother Patricia were forced to pack their entire lives into cheap cardboard boxes. They had to leave behind the manicured lawns, the heated swimming pool, and the massive formal dining room where they had spent years making me feel completely worthless. Because their assets were seized, they could not afford to buy a new house. They were forced to sign a lease for a tiny, cramped, two-bedroom rented condo in a rundown neighborhood miles away from their wealthy suburban bubble. The physical downgrade was devastating, but the social exile was what truly broke their spirits. My mother had always defined her entire self-worth by her status in the Oak Ridge Country Club. But reality is incredibly cruel to people who pretend to be rich. When the first of the month arrived, their automatic payment for the expensive country club membership dues completely bounced. The club management immediately suspended their account and sent a very public notice of termination. The wealthy wives Patricia had gossiped with for decades instantly turned their backs on her. In their elite circle, bankruptcy was considered a highly contagious disease. When Patricia tried to call her friends to explain the situation, they simply let her calls go to voicemail. Richard was entirely cast out of his exclusive golfing groups. They were completely erased from the high society they had worshipped. They had spent decades building an elaborate fortress of lies and entitlement, but that entire fortress had crumbled to absolute dust in a matter of weeks. The most poetic justice of all was that they had completely engineered their own destruction. If they had simply attended my graduation or shown me a single ounce of genuine respect, I might have warned them about the toxic debt bundle before Vertex Global purchased it. But they had chosen to ignore me and praise a fraud instead. They had made their arrogant choices, and now they had to live with the devastating consequences every single day. There were no more fancy brunches and no more expensive vacations. Their days were now consumed by stressful meetings with bankruptcy lawyers and endless arguments inside their tiny rented apartment. As for me, I never answered another phone call from them. I completely erased them from my new life. The legal bloodbath had fully cleansed my world, leaving no trace of their toxic presence behind. I am sitting in my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Vertex Global headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer a completely unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline. The afternoon sunlight pours into the room, casting a warm, golden glow across my large mahogany desk. It has been exactly 6 months since I walked away from my family at the Oak Ridge Country Club, and my life has never been more peaceful. I take a slow sip of my hot black coffee and look at the complex financial algorithms running smoothly on my dual monitors. I am thriving. My distressed assets division has exceeded every single quarterly projection, and my team of analysts is absolutely brilliant. I am respected for my mind and valued for my contributions. The exhausting, suffocating weight of constantly trying to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me has completely vanished. Every single day I am challenged by complex market variables, and I rise to the occasion with a clear and focused mind. The massive salary and the restricted stock options are certainly a wonderful reward, but the true prize is the complete autonomy I now possess. I answer to nobody but myself. 6 months ago, I sat alone in a crowded university auditorium staring at 3 empty chairs. I felt like an absolute failure that day. I felt invisible and unworthy of love. I believed that because my parents did not value my achievements were somehow meaningless. But looking back now, I realize those empty chairs were the greatest gift my family could have ever given me. Their absence forced me to finally stop looking for their validation and start building my own foundation. I stopped begging for a seat at their table and realized I was entirely capable of building my own house. The silence that followed my departure from their lives was initially startling, but it quickly blossomed into profound, absolute peace. Every morning I wake up, and I do not have to brace myself for a manipulative text message or a demeaning phone call. I do not have to worry about funding my brother's next vanity project or managing my mother's fragile social ego. My energy belongs entirely to me. I changed my phone number and moved into a beautiful penthouse apartment in the city. I did not leave any forwarding address. Occasionally, I hear brief updates through the corporate grapevine about what happened to my brother Tyler and my parents. Tyler is currently awaiting his federal trial for corporate embezzlement, living in a cheap motel while his public defender tries to keep him out of federal prison. Jasmine divorced him the second her luxury car was repossessed, completely abandoning him when the stolen money dried up. My parents are still living in their cramped rented condo, entirely ostracized by the wealthy society they once worshipped. They tried to reach out to Vertex Global Human Resources a few times, demanding to speak with me, but my corporate security team handled them swiftly and permanently. I feel absolutely no guilt about their current circumstances. I did not ruin their lives. Their own greed, their relentless arrogance, and their toxic favoritism ruined their lives. I simply held up a mirror and handed them the bill. Society puts a massive amount of pressure on the concept of biological family. We are constantly told that we must forgive our relatives no matter how terribly they treat us, simply because we share the same bloodline. We are conditioned to believe that setting boundaries with toxic parents or entitled siblings is somehow a selfish act. But my journey has taught me that this is a dangerous and completely manipulative lie. Forgiveness is not an obligation, and loyalty should never be demanded by people who refuse to offer you basic human decency in return. Over the past 6 months, I have built a completely new family. My family is now made up of brilliant, supportive colleagues who celebrate my victories and challenge me to grow. My family consists of friends who show up when they promise to show up and who love me for exactly who I am, without requiring me to shrink myself to protect their fragile egos. The truth is that shared DNA is nothing more than a biological coincidence. It does not automatically grant someone the right to disrespect you, manipulate you, or drain you of your hard-earned resources. You have the absolute right to curate the people who have access to your energy. You have the right to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. I used to think I was the broken one in my family. I thought I was the scapegoat because I was inherently flawed. But I finally understand that I was targeted precisely because I was independent and capable. They needed me to feel small, so they could feel big. They needed me to be the financial backup plan for their golden child. When you finally stop seeking approval from people who are determined to see you fail, you suddenly have an endless reservoir of energy to invest in your own brilliant future. The scapegoat has officially left the pen, and she is never going back. I look out over the sprawling city, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the beautiful, completely unbothered life I have built. I survived their cruelty, and I transformed my pain into absolute power. Blood does not make you family, respect does. When toxic people demand a seat at your table, buy the restaurant, and revoke their membership, your success is your ultimate revenge, and your peace is your final victory. If you have ever had to legally, financially, or emotionally cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace and your wallet, I want to hear from you. Drop your stories in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button and like this video to join a community of people who refuse to be victims of toxic family dynamics. Your story matters, and your freedom is absolutely worth the fight. The story of Samantha teaches us a profound and necessary lesson about self-worth and the absolute power of financial independence. For too long, society has pushed the narrative that family must be kept together at all costs, even when those costs require you to sacrifice your own mental health and your own hard-earned success. Samantha demonstrates that you do not have to accept the role of the invisible scapegoat. You do not have to shrink yourself to make entitled people feel comfortable. Her journey proves that true power comes from recognizing your own massive value and refusing to let toxic relatives use guilt to siphon your resources. The most crucial takeaway from this story is that boundaries are not just emotional, they must also be practical and sometimes financial. When dealing with manipulative family members who view you only as a safety net or a bank account, emotional arguments will never work. You must speak the only language they truly understand, which is the language of consequences. Samantha did not yell or cry to make them respect her. She used undeniable facts, legal structures, and complete financial detachment to protect herself. If you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your achievements are dismissed, but your resources are constantly demanded, remember this lesson. You hold the pen to your own life story. You have the absolute right to redirect your energy away from those who drain you and invest it entirely into your own growth. Please share this message with someone who might be struggling with a toxic family dynamic. Let them know they are not obligated to set themselves on fire to keep others warm. Subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories of resilience, and leave a comment below, sharing the moment you finally realized your own worth. Let us build a strong community where breaking generational trauma is celebrated.